In the hushed silence of Rome's nighttime streets, when the clamor of markets had faded and the voices of senators were stilled, the city seemed to breathe in secret. Torches guttered against the stone, leaving pockets of darkness where imagination could roam. It was in this realm of flickering shadows that whispers first gathered around the name of Messalina. Few could say when the murmurs began, but they carried with them the promise of a woman whose influence would extend far beyond her years. In the cool breath of midnight, Rome was always listening, and it remembered the echoes of those who dared to seize its heart. The Palatine Hill itself seemed to brood with anticipation, its looming palaces like watchful sentinels against the night. Within those walls, emperors slept uneasily, burdened by the weight of power and the fragility of trust. Yet beyond their chambers, in the dim corridors scented with oil and polished bronze, a story was taking shape. Messalina, though not yet infamous, was already becoming the focus of Rome's watchful eyes. She moved within the empire's pulse as if she had always belonged, a figure neither entirely seen nor fully hidden, a presence like velvet brushing against the skin of history. To speak of her was to risk entangling oneself in rumor, for the lines between truth and invention were as blurred as the glow of torchlight on ancient walls. Rome was a city that thrived on gossip as much as grain, and each whispered tale held the power to sway minds and topple lives. Messalina's early steps into prominence were laced with this double-edged weapon. People described her beauty with breathless awe, but it was not beauty alone that unsettled them. It was the suggestion that behind her eyes lay ambition untamed. In a world where perception could define reality, she already commanded a dangerous allure. The night itself seemed complicit in her rise. The stars, scattered across the Roman sky, blinked as if keeping counsel over the shifting tides of fortune. A cooling breeze stirred the laurels planted in courtyards, carrying with it a scent of roses and iron. Rome, a city steeped in both ceremony and shadow, understood that its rulers were not just men but myths, and that women at their side could be architects of fate. Messalina was entering this mythology, not with the slow steps of obscurity, but with a stride sharpened by circumstance, marriage, and destiny. When Claudius, awkward and underestimated, found himself emperor, few imagined that his wife would become a figure as debated and enduring as he. In the twilight hours, when senators weighed their fortunes and slaves exchanged rumors over cheap wine, her name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. The empire was vast, its legions stretched to distant frontiers, but its true battleground was often the chamber, the banquet, the whispered council where decisions were dressed in velvet and sealed with nods. Messalina had entered this battlefield armed with something sharper than steel, the subtle mastery of influence. It is said that those who walk Rome's marble halls must learn to become shadows themselves, to bend without breaking, to listen more than speak. Messalina embodied this lesson, weaving herself into the rhythms of power with the patience of a spider in its web. She was not yet the figure of scandal, not yet the woman of rumor and betrayal, she was instead the promise of what ambition, opportunity, and silence could create. Rome did not yet know her fully, but the city, ever restless, could feel her taking root in its soil. At banquets where laughter was loud and goblets overflowed, her presence softened the edges of formality. She listened, she observed, she remembered. Every gesture, every pause, every slip of the tongue was stored away as if each detail were a thread in a tapestry she alone was weaving. Senators who dismissed her as ornamental failed to notice that their words often resurfaced in the emperor's ear, altered, reframed, sometimes sharpened. In the art of influence, silence was as potent as speech, and Messalina wielded both with precision that belied her youth. The city's poor, who rarely glimpsed her except during public appearances, crafted their own myths about her. To them, she was another figure in the endless procession of imperial faces, elevated beyond reach yet hauntingly human in her rumored desires. Her image, carried in statues and coins, was both familiar and distant, a reminder of the unseen powers shaping their daily bread. But even among them, stories began to take root, tales of generosity or cruelty, none verifiable, all persuasive. In Rome, reputation was currency, and hers was already inflating with interest. It is tempting to imagine her as a figure sculpted entirely by malice, but that would rob her of depth. In truth, Messalina was born into a world where survival required calculation. The court was a crucible that melted away innocence and left only those strong. Enough to endure. She had married into power, yes, but she also had to secure her place within it, surrounded by rivals eager to exploit any weakness. In such a climate, every smile concealed an evaluation, every friendship was conditional, and every night was a negotiation between safety and ruin. The torchlit banquets, the marble corridors, the jeweled processions, all were stages upon which Messalina played her part. She could be charming, radiant, and seemingly unthreatening, and yet those who watched closely knew she had a gift for slipping beneath defenses. To underestimate her was to risk becoming her instrument, for influence is rarely wielded openly. Rome, with its labyrinthine politics and insatiable appetite for scandal, offered her the perfect canvas upon which to paint her ascent, and she approached it not as a guest, but as an artist. In the hush of night, when the empire's pulse slowed, one could almost sense her presence lingering like perfume in the air. Those who served her in private chambers would speak in low tones, never raising their voices above the rustle of curtains or the clink of silver. They understood that their mistress carried not only beauty but a kind of dangerous clarity, a knowledge that words could be as binding as chains. To them, she was both benefactor and threat, an empress whose favor could elevate but whose displeasure could extinguish. Rome had seen women of influence before: Livia, Agrippina, Octavia, but Messalina would embody something different. While others cloaked their power in restraint, she seemed to embrace its perilous dance openly, if not always wisely. Her rise was less about restraint and more about audacity, less about patience and more about the hunger to experience what others denied her. This difference would shape her legend, for while history often admired subtlety, it never forgot those who overstepped. Already, her shadow was darker, more velvet than marble, softer but no less enveloping. In the markets by day, vendors shouted of figs and olives, of cloaks and sandals. But by night, when the stalls were abandoned and the stones were slick with dew, the conversations turned. Messalina's name was not yet a curse, not yet an infamy, but it was present. Rumor spread faster than fire, and even the humblest citizens sensed that she was not simply another empress. Rome's collective imagination, ever eager for tales of excess and downfall, found fertile ground in her life. She became the canvas for their fears and desires, even before scandal crowned her. The Palatine palaces were not merely dwellings but theaters of fate. Marble steps polished by countless feet seemed to absorb the weight of secrets, and Messalina's footsteps joined this eternal rhythm. Servants carried lamps that lit her path, but she needed no light to find her way. Her presence seemed to claim space with quiet certainty, and those who crossed her gaze felt the weight of unspoken possibility. In the silence between words, she promised something that could not be ignored: transformation, for better or worse, of every life she touched. It is easy to forget that Rome itself was both stage and spectator in her story. Its arches, forums, and arenas were filled with people who demanded both stability and spectacle. An empress could not merely exist, she had to inspire or fear, devotion or hatred. Messalina, whether by design or destiny, inspired them all. Each glance she cast, each gesture she performed, was scrutinized, magnified, and retold until the truth was almost indistinguishable from invention. Thus the city became her mirror, reflecting her in 1,000 fractured ways. The shadows of Rome's night often carried memories sharper than daylight. In those hours, when the empire's ambitions seemed less certain, Messalina's own ambitions gleamed brightest. She was more than a wife, more than a mother, more than a figurehead. She was a participant in the great, dangerous game of empire, where victories were whispered and losses could mean annihilation. Her early moves, hidden from history's clearer gaze, were already setting the stage for what would become both her triumph and her tragedy. The whispers of her beauty, her charm, and her appetite for influence reached even the ears of those who had never seen her. They spoke of her as if she were both goddess and ghost, an ever-present possibility in the empire's destiny. Rome's storytellers, eager to weave tales of grandeur and downfall, found in her a muse they did not yet fully understand. She was an empress of velvet, her shadow stretching over streets that had witnessed centuries of ambition and betrayal. Yet even as her story began, it was clear that it would not end quietly. For those who gazed upon her in person, the impression was unforgettable. The set of her features, the way she moved, the confidence that clung to her like perfume, these were not the marks of a passive consort. She seemed to command even silence, to bend attention without effort. Senators who thought themselves wise in the ways of power often found their words faltering in her presence, as though they sensed, dimly, that she carried within her the capacity to change their fortunes. In such moments, the shadow of her influence grew thicker, more velvet, more consuming. It was within this tapestry of whispers, shadows, and half-seen gestures that Messalina's legend began. She had not yet betrayed, had not yet scandalized, had not yet met her fall. But the seeds of all that was to come were already sown. The city knew her name, the palace felt her presence, and the empire, though vast, was already adjusting to her rhythm. She was the empress not of marble solidity, but of velvet shadow, soft to the touch, yet suffocating when it enclosed. Rome was listening, and it would never forget her. The velvet shadow stretched longer with each passing night, binding her to the empire in ways that neither Claudius nor his advisers could fully grasp. To some, she was the embodiment of promise, a mother who would secure dynastic continuity. To others, she was the embodiment of danger, a woman whose very being threatened the fragile order of things. Both views held some truth, for Messalina was not confined to one shape or story. She was, in the end, many things at once: wife, mother, empress, conspirator, and ghost of Rome's darkest imaginings. Thus began the tale of Messalina, not with the thunder of legions or the declarations of emperors, but with whispers in the velvet darkness. In the hush of Rome's endless night, her story stirred awake, fragile yet inevitable. And though history would judge her with cruelty and fascination, in this moment, before betrayal, before ruin, she was still a presence becoming, a shadow stretching over marble, a figure destined to leave marks no cleansing rain could wash away. The velvet shadow was here, and Rome would never again sleep quite as soundly. Messalina did not emerge from obscurity into the world of emperors. She was born already entwined within Rome's most powerful bloodlines. From the beginning, she belonged to that exclusive sphere where names carried more weight than legions and where ancestry itself was a form of inheritance as potent as gold. Her family traced its lineage back to the Julian and Claudian houses, the twin dynasties that had sculpted the empire's identity. To be born in such a circle was both privilege and burden, for every step, every choice, was measured not against one's own desires but against the endless expectations of Rome's memory. In her early years, Messalina would have been surrounded by a world dripping with ritual and grandeur, where marble villas overlooked gardens rich with fountains and laurel trees. The laughter of playmates mingled with the stern instruction of tutors, each lesson reminding her that her life was not her own. For daughters of the nobility, the empire demanded obedience, dignity, and an understanding that their marriages were chess moves in the larger game of politics. Even as a child, Messalina's gaze would have been sharpened by this truth. She was destined to serve Rome, though in what way, no one yet knew. Her relatives were names etched into the marble of history, figures whose deeds were discussed in forums and preserved in scrolls. These connections meant that her life was never private. She was always under the gaze of those who saw her as both opportunity and threat. Within the elite circles of Rome, alliances were born not of affection but of calculation, and Messalina's presence alone could strengthen or weaken a family's standing. From the cradle, she was taught to embody grace and restraint, to wear a mask of composure while learning how to read the silent languages of ambition. The circle into which she was born was not merely familial, it was the circle of empire itself. Senators, generals, and courtiers moved like pieces in a vast theater, and every child of noble blood was groomed to play a role. To walk in her family's villa was to hear conversations about succession, loyalty, and the frailty of emperors. From whispered debates around polished tables to the soft shuffling of parchment in candlelit rooms, the air was heavy with the awareness that Rome's greatness was fragile, its rulers mortal, and its enemies ever waiting. For Messalina, such lessons were nourishment, not burden. The marriage that would later join her to Claudius did not emerge as a tale of passion but of inevitability. In Rome, marriages were contracts designed to bind families together, to secure political advantage, and to ensure continuity of influence. Claudius, awkward and often underestimated, was not the obvious choice for an ambitious young noblewoman. Yet the circle of her lineage placed her directly in his path, and the empire itself conspired to intertwine their destinies. She would become not only his wife but his Augusta, his empress, his partner in the strange duet of ruling a restless world. By the time of her union with Claudius, Messalina had already absorbed the art of adapting to shifting circumstances. She would have understood the silent negotiations that led to the match, the weighing of alliances, and the balancing of risks. While poets might describe the joining as romantic, Messalina likely saw it for what it was, a strategic placement within the empire's beating heart. Yet within her acceptance of this role lay something more subtle, a recognition that in playing the part assigned to her, she could also carve her own story. As Augusta, Messalina bore not only a title but a weight that few could carry without faltering. She was expected to embody the virtues of Rome: modesty, loyalty, fertility, and the ability to secure dynastic continuity. Her womb was not merely her own but Rome's hope for the future. In giving Claudius children, she cemented her role within the empire's lineage. The births of Claudia Octavia and Britannicus were triumphs celebrated not just by family but by the entire state, their cries echoing as promises of continuity in a world ever fearful of rupture. Yet for all the public celebration, private anxieties lingered. In Rome, every heir was both blessing and target. The palace corridors, decorated with frescoes and guarded by marble gods, echoed with the whispers of those who calculated futures even as infants cooed in their mother's arms. Messalina would have known this well, cradling her children while also shielding them from the eyes that saw in their tiny forms either a promise to protect or a threat to eliminate. It was motherhood, but motherhood sharpened into political armor, each embrace a defense against the empire's ruthless gaze. Messalina's marriage also required her to share a life with Claudius, a man many contemporaries dismissed as weak or eccentric. But his underestimation was deceptive. Beneath his halting speech and scholarly demeanor lay a shrewd survivor, one who had outlived more dangerous rivals by seeming harmless. Messalina's role beside him was to strengthen his position, to provide the outward image of stability and legitimacy. In public, she walked with grace at his side, her presence a living declaration that Claudius was not merely tolerated but chosen by destiny. The ceremonies that welcomed her into her role were awash with spectacle. Incense curled into the sky, priests chanted prayers, and laurel crowns gleamed beneath the sun. To the people, she was an image of fertility and continuity, the mother who would guard the future of the Julio-Claudian line. But within the palaces, those same ceremonies marked her as both figurehead and target. Every bow she received was matched by a hidden calculation, every cheer by a whispered suspicion. To be Augusta was to be elevated beyond the reach of the ordinary, but also to be trapped within the cage of expectation. Her circle, though prestigious, was also suffocating. Each step she took was measured, each gesture scrutinized. Even the way she held her children or greeted the emperor could become fodder for gossip or suspicion. For a woman of her intelligence and ambition, the strictures of this circle were both prison and opportunity. She could not escape the scrutiny, but she could learn to bend it, to shape the perceptions of those who watched. In this way, Messalina began to understand that her life was not only survival but performance, a role played endlessly upon Rome's vast stage. Messalina was not the first woman to occupy such a role, nor would she be the last, but she embodied the contradictions of empire more starkly than many before her. She was expected to embody modesty while living in opulence, to remain silent while holding influence, to be both ornamental and essential. Such contradictions were impossible to balance without distortion, and Messalina, sharp of mind and restless of spirit, could not be content with stillness. The circle that bound her was one she both adorned and tested, stretching its limits even as she relied upon it. Her children were symbols not just of maternal pride but of imperial continuity. Britannicus, especially, represented the future of Claudius's line, and with that future came both promise and peril. Messalina's identity as mother deepened her entanglement with Rome's destiny, for through her son lay the empire's hope for stability. She was no longer merely Claudius's wife but the mother of an heir, a position that magnified her influence while also painting her as a target for those who coveted the throne. The circle of her life grew ever tighter, binding her to both glory and danger. The presence of Claudia Octavia further secured her legacy. As a daughter destined for marriage into another powerful family, Octavia was both treasure and tool, a promise of new alliances. For Messalina, raising her daughter was as political as it was maternal, for every decision about Octavia's future would ripple through Rome's power structures. Even in the cradle, the girl was a coin in the empire's exchange of loyalty, and Messalina held her with the knowledge that her child's innocence would one day be consumed by the same machinery that had consumed her own youth. Messalina's position at Claudius's side was not passive, despite the illusions crafted by her detractors. While official records might downplay her role, those within the palace knew she shaped decisions both directly and indirectly. In audiences, her presence lent legitimacy to Claudius's words. In private, her counsel could tilt the balance of judgment. She was not the emperor, but she was his companion, and companionship in such circles meant influence. Even if history later reduced her to scandal, those who watched her closely in those early years knew she was much more than rumor allowed. The circle of empire was not without its dangers. Rome's history was littered with women who had risen too high or demanded too much, and the price for their audacity was always severe. Messalina, aware of this legacy, learned to weave her influence subtly, hiding ambition beneath layers of charm and obedience. Yet the very nature of her position made subtlety difficult. She was too visible, too close to the emperor, too entangled in matters of succession to be dismissed as inconsequential. Every step she took toward power carried with it the echo of past downfalls. As she grew into her role, Messalina became the embodiment of Rome's contradictions. To the people, she was a goddess-like figure, radiant in public ceremonies, the mother of heirs, the promise of stability. To the palace, she was a strategist, a negotiator, and perhaps a threat. To Claudius, she was both comfort and complexity, a wife who brought legitimacy but also tested the fragile structures of his rule. This multiplicity made her dangerous to define, and Rome, in its hunger for stories, began crafting its own versions of her long before scandal consumed her name. It is important to remember that in these early years, Messalina's reputation was not yet poisoned. She was admired for her beauty, her fertility, and her role in strengthening Claudius's claim. Her presence at ceremonies reassured the people that the emperor was not alone, that he had a family, a future, and a lineage secured. This admiration, however, was never pure. Rome admired, but it also envied, and envy in the empire's heart was often the seed from which hatred bloomed. The circle that had raised her up would one day demand her fall. The villas she inhabited were filled with reminders of her lineage, busts of ancestors, inscriptions carved into stone, tokens of victories long past. Each image reminded her that she was never free of her history. She carried the weight of generations, and the empire expected her to add to that weight without faltering. To live in such a house was to live in dialogue with ghosts, and Messalina, sensitive to her surroundings, must have felt their presence guiding and judging her in equal measure. She was not alone, but she was never truly free. The bond between her and Claudius was, at first, one of necessity, yet necessity often breeds familiarity. In time, their relationship developed rhythms, rituals, and unspoken understandings. Claudius relied upon her presence, her youth, her ability to soften his image before the people. She, in turn, relied upon the protection of his title, the security of her children's place in the line of succession, and the opportunities that came with proximity to ultimate authority. Their marriage was not passion's blaze but duty's enduring fire, though in its embers lay both warmth and danger. Thus Messalina's life, from birth to marriage to motherhood, was framed within circles of family, of empire, of duty, and of ambition. She was born to these circles, raised within them, and bound to them more tightly with every year. Yet she was also restless, a woman whose spirit could not be confined to silent obedience. The circle was both her crown and her chain, her stage and her prison. Within its polished confines, she prepared for the choices that would one day define her, choices that would lift her name into history not as a dutiful Augusta, but as Rome's most infamous shadow. And so the circle closed around her, gleaming yet constricting, promising both glory and peril. Messalina, the girl born of noble blood, the wife of an emperor, the mother of heirs, stepped further into the heart of Rome's destiny. She was still young, still admired, still secure in the eyes of many. Yet already, within her circle, There were cracks invisible to most but inevitable to her fate. What began as privilege would soon become the stage for betrayal, and the empire that had once celebrated her would learn to whisper her name in tones of fear. The palace whispered with the hush of 100 sandals against polished marble, a place where silence carried more weight than words. Courtyards bloomed with roses imported from distant lands, their fragrance a veil that covered the sharper scents of ambition and fear. Messalina walked here with her head held high, her eyes keen and restless, sensing the currents beneath the stillness. Every tapestry, every column, every quiet glance hid something, plots woven as tightly as the silk curtains swaying in the Roman breeze. Columns rose like guardians around her, bearing the gilded weight of empire and history, yet they also bore witness to the hidden dealings of its present. The mosaics beneath her steps shone with bright stones, depicting gods who watched from eternity as mortals traded favors in their names. Messalina, draped in flowing fabrics that shimmered like water, knew this was no home of peace, it was a chamber of games. Each room was a theater, each visitor an actor rehearsing lines meant to wound or seduce. In the audience halls, laughter drifted like a song played off-key. Senators with their lined faces, women with jewels glinting like captured stars, slaves moving swiftly with wine and fruit all became part of the endless masquerade. Messalina understood it well, for she herself wore many masks. To her husband Claudius, she was the dutiful empress, to her lovers, a flame untamed, to the people, a distant figure in ivory robes. Yet behind the veil, she was calculating, always shifting her place in the grand mosaic of Rome. The silken drapes of her private chambers fell heavy, embroidered with scenes of nymphs and gods, yet they were not mere decorations. They muffled secrets, guarded whispers exchanged in the dim glow of oil lamps. Here, in the hush of night, alliances were struck, desires confessed, betrayals conceived. Messalina moved among them like a conductor before her orchestra, knowing precisely when to let the music swell and when to silence it. The palace gardens stretched like a labyrinth beyond stone walls, their pathways shadowed by cypress trees and dotted with marble fountains where water danced like silver under the moon. Here two secrets unfolded. Lovers met among the hedges, conspirators whispered beneath the gaze of carved deities. Messalina walked these paths, her hand grazing the leaves, her mind weaving futures as easily as one might braid a vine. The garden was a sanctuary to others, but for her it was a stage. At banquets, where golden chalices clinked and roasted meats filled the air with spice and smoke, she played her role with elegance. Her smile was soft, her voice honeyed, her presence radiant. Yet beneath the surface, her mind worked faster than any tongue. Who leaned too close to whom? Who exchanged glances across the table? Who held back their laughter until the emperor turned away? She collected such pieces as others might collect jewels, building a treasure trove of leverage. Silk cushions in secret chambers bore the imprints of bodies and bargains alike. Messalina often reclined here, her eyes fixed on the ceiling frescoes where gods watched mortals with expressions both stern and amused. She thought often of those gods, did they laugh at her ambition, or admire her courage? Perhaps they too had played games in the palaces of Olympus, using lust and betrayal as weapons sharper than swords. She, in her mortal form, merely carried on their tradition. The eunuchs who guarded the inner chambers whispered their own tales in hushed corners, tales of her lovers slipping through corridors at night, of gifts exchanged beneath the folds of her robe, of letters burned in bronze braziers before dawn. These stories spread like fire, flickering through the city until even the stones seemed to hum with her name. Yet no matter how often tongues wagged, Messalina never faltered. The palace itself seemed to bend around her will. There was a room where scrolls lay stacked upon shelves of cedar wood, letters sealed with wax that carried promises, threats, or secret pacts. Messalina entered often, her fingers trailing along the spines, her eyes sharp as she chose which knowledge to release and which to bury. Information was the finest silk of all, she knew, delicate, pliable, and capable of binding men tighter than chains. Within these walls, silence was not emptiness but a cloak of power. The empress moved like water between chambers, slipping into spaces others feared to tread. In the baths, steam rose in fragrant clouds, cloaking her form and those of her confidants. Here, the barriers of toga and title dissolved, and truths were spoken with ease. Messalina learned much in the shifting fog, her ears tuned to every sigh, every half-whisper. Steam hid blushes and betrayals alike, yet she saw through both. On festival nights, the palace blazed with torches and echoed with music, but even in revelry the air held tension. Messalina danced with measured steps, her bracelets clinking in rhythm with drums, her laughter bright but never careless. The men around her stared, captivated, but behind her laughter she kept her watchful gaze. The palace was never safer than when it seemed most alive, and she thrived in its chaos, plucking truths from the noise like jewels from sand. The great dining hall, with its vaulted ceilings and golden light, was a place where alliances were born and shattered in the time it took to drink a goblet of wine. Messalina reclined on couches strewn with silks, her hands resting lightly on her lap as if they held nothing. Yet in truth, they held everything. With a glance she could unmake a man's courage, with a word she could promise glory or despair. The hall's walls rang with laughter, but beneath it pulsed the rhythm of dread. Her private library, filled with scrolls of philosophy and poetry, was both sanctuary and weapon. Messalina read the works of lovers and cynics, poets and historians, not only to indulge but to learn the language of influence. She memorized verses to recite at just the right moment, wielding words like a blade that left no wound visible. She understood that in a palace of silk and secrets, power was not taken with steel, it was coaxed with phrases whispered at dawn. The marble atriums echoed with footsteps at all hours, a reminder that the palace never slept. Servants carried baskets of fruit and urns of wine, their faces downcast, their ears sharpened. Messalina knew they heard more than most senators, and she cultivated their loyalty with gifts, smiles, and subtle threats. To control the whispers of servants was to command the veins of the empire, for it was through them that rumors flowed like blood. Messalina's daughters and attendants grew within these walls, sheltered from the world yet immersed in its shadows. They learned early to watch her eyes, to heed her silences, to follow the rhythm of her moods. The palace shaped them as much as it shaped her, teaching that survival meant not just living but thriving in a web of intrigue. Each girl would carry the imprint of these silken walls upon her heart forever. The statues in the courtyards seemed to shift with the sun, their stone gazes falling upon her wherever she moved. Messalina often wondered if they judged her, or if they too had once been mortals caught in the snares of desire and ambition. Perhaps they had walked through palaces of their own, wearing crowns of laurel and robes of silk, before being frozen into stone as reminders of fleeting power. She walked past them unflinching, daring their silence to condemn her. The palace kitchens roared with heat and clamor, a world far from marble halls yet just as essential. Messalina passed through now and then, her presence sending slaves into hurried bows. She understood the value of bread and wine as keenly as she did of silk and secrets. A well-fed populace praised its rulers, a hungry one plotted rebellion. Even in this humble place, her shadow fell long, reminding all that she was both mistress and judge. In the stables where horses snorted and pawed, Messalina found a strange freedom. The scent of hay and leather, the restless shifting of the beasts, spoke of untamed power. She often paused here, stroking the neck of a favored mare, her mind quiet for a rare moment. Yet even in this place of respite, whispers followed her. Every stable boy knew tales, and every tale was another string in her web. By night, the palace glowed with lanterns that softened marble into gold. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching into forms that seemed alive. Messalina would stand at her balcony, gazing over Rome, the city flickering with its own constellation of lights. She felt both small and immense, one woman yet the axis of countless schemes. The silk of her gown fluttered in the wind, as if reminding her that all she held could unravel with a single pull. Messalina's laughter echoed in the halls, light as a bell yet heavy with implication. Those who heard it wondered if it was joy or mockery, love or warning. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath when she laughed, aware that such sound carried weight beyond amusement. To dwell in her orbit was to be drawn into her games, whether one wished it or not. And so the palace endured, a fortress of beauty and menace, its walls soaked with secrets and its rooms draped in silk. Messalina reigned not with armies or decrees but with the subtle art of presence, her eyes sharp, her touch fleeting, her voice a thread weaving countless fates. The palace belonged to her not by right of title, but by right of mastery. It was her kingdom of whispers, her stage of shadows, her palace of silk and secrets. The Empress's eyes were not merely windows to her soul but instruments sharpened over years of quiet survival. They shimmered like obsidian wet with dew, reflecting not only the gilded torchlight of the palace but the unseen intentions of every soul who crossed her path. To the untrained, her gaze seemed soft, perhaps distracted, yet beneath that veil lay calculation. Each flicker, each narrowing of her lashes, was a ledger of loyalties and betrayals, kept more faithfully than any scroll. Her eyes first learned to measure the world in the court of Claudius, where senators and courtiers masked their greed beneath eloquent speeches. Messalina watched them not as a child listens to stories but as a predator tracks prey, marking hesitation, ambition, or deceit. Her silence during debates was not passivity, it was collection. The flicker of a senator's glance, the tightening of a soldier's jaw, each subtle movement was gathered, stored, and sorted like gems in a secret casket. In the private chambers, her gaze softened, though never fully. To Claudius, she was a loyal wife, her eyes lowered in feigned humility, gleaming with affection when the emperor stumbled through his duties. To her lovers, her eyes burned with fire, promising pleasures that ensnared more deeply than chains. Yet even in passion, calculation lingered. She read every twitch of longing, every sigh of weakness, extracting knowledge as one draws honey from the comb. At banquets, when the palace swelled with song and the laughter of Rome's most powerful men, Messalina's eyes danced as much as her smile. She cast her gaze not carelessly but with intent, lingering on one senator a heartbeat longer, glancing away from another as if he were dust. The men believed themselves chosen or dismissed by chance, yet they played roles in her design. Her gaze was invitation, dismissal, and warning, all woven into the glimmer of pupils beneath jeweled hairpins. Her children, still young and unaware of the storm that swirled about them, found comfort in her gaze. Messalina would cradle them, her eyes tender, almost maternal, as if the world beyond the palace could never intrude. But even here, in these sacred moments, her eyes were heavy with thought. She imagined futures, her son on the throne, her daughter married to strength. Her gaze sought to mold their destinies even as it caressed their innocence. Among the slaves, her eyes inspired both fear and devotion. When Messalina looked upon a servant, she saw more than a body carrying water or bread, she saw ears that heard, hands that touched, lips that could betray. One glance from her could freeze a slave into silence or inspire a vow of loyalty that would endure through fire. They whispered among themselves that she could see into their souls, and perhaps they were not wrong. Her eyes also haunted the gardens of the palace. Beneath moonlight, as roses opened their crimson hearts to the night, Messalina's gaze traveled across the hedges and fountains, searching for shadows of conspirators. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind seemed alive under her scrutiny. Lovers who dared to meet in secret feared her presence, for her eyes seemed capable of reaching them even when she was not there, a silent watcher within the darkened hedges. When she entered the Senate chambers, her eyes became harder than marble. Though women held no seat among senators, her gaze from the side carried weight. Men stumbled over words beneath it, their speeches faltering, their arguments softened. They told themselves they served Claudius, but deep within, they knew they performed before her. She did not speak, but her eyes judged, and their judgments stung more than any decree could. In the bathhouses where steam rose thick and voices carried faintly, her gaze shimmered through the fog. Women whispered secrets they thought safe in the mist, but Messalina's eyes caught the truth behind their words. She noticed the tremor in a hand, the slight blush, the darting glance. Steam might veil flesh, but it could not shield the eyes from hers. The baths became another theater, the mist a curtain behind which she listened and learned. When festivals swept Rome into wild abandon, Messalina joined with practiced ease, her eyes glittering like stars as dancers twirled and wine flowed. Yet even in revelry, she missed nothing. She saw the soldier slipping away with a senator's daughter, the merchant clutching a gift meant for bribery, the priest lingering too long near forbidden pleasures. Her eyes gathered these details as bees gather nectar, weaving them into a honeycomb of influence. Messalina's gaze was not always harsh or cunning. At times, it softened into a mirror of Rome itself, vast, contradictory, filled with longing and shadow. Poets who dared meet her eyes claimed inspiration, their verses infused with her mystery. Painters, too, struggled to capture the depth of her pupils, always failing to render the glimmer that seemed alive. They said her eyes contained both invitation and exile, the warmth of spring and the frost of winter in one glance. Claudius himself often mistook the language of her gaze. Where he saw devotion, others saw manipulation. Where he believed in her loyalty, others read her schemes. Messalina perfected the art of lowering her lashes at the right moment, of lifting her gaze just when his doubt grew heavy. She played her husband like a lyre, each note tuned by her eyes until he believed the melody of her faithfulness. Yet behind that performance, she planned. When lovers came to her chambers, trembling with desire, they often spoke afterward of her eyes rather than her touch. They claimed that in her gaze lay both paradise and peril, as if each caress of her glance could bless or damn them. Many fell not to her embrace but to the illusion her eyes spun, an illusion of being chosen, of being irreplaceable. Yet once they turned away, they discovered they were but another stone in her mosaic. Her gaze also reached beyond the palace walls. When she traveled through Rome, carried in her gilded litter, citizens looked up to catch her eyes. Some swore she smiled upon them, others whispered that her glance foretold their ruin. The marketplace paused when she passed, every vendor, every child, every beggar sensing the weight of her regard. To be seen by Messalina was to be remembered or marked. As her power grew, whispers spread that the empress's eyes could summon fate itself. Superstition tangled with truth, and soon senators crossed themselves when she looked their way, slaves pressed talismans to their lips, and rivals avoided her gaze entirely. They feared not just her cunning but the myth that her eyes could curse. Messalina allowed the tales to grow, for power cloaked in mystery often endures longer than power made plain. Even in moments of solitude, her eyes betrayed her mind's restlessness. When she stared into polished bronze mirrors, she did not see her reflection alone but the empire stretched behind her. Each line of her face, each curve of her brow, became a symbol of destiny she sought to command. She watched herself as others did, testing which gaze to offer tomorrow, the lovers, the mothers, the conspirators, the empresses. But her eyes could not mask everything. In rare hours of fatigue, when shadows grew heavy and silence pressed upon her, they revealed a flicker of fear. She knew the precariousness of her throne, the sharpness of Rome's teeth. For just a heartbeat, her eyes would lose their steel, and the mirror would show not an empress but a woman trapped within her own designs. Such moments passed quickly, hidden from all but the most intimate attendants. As her betrayals multiplied, so too did the scrutiny upon her. Courtiers whispered, senators glared, and even Claudius's advisers began to study her eyes with suspicion. They sought signs of falsehood, of cracks in her mask. Yet Messalina was not so easily undone. Her eyes remained her shield, her dagger, her veil, concealing the tempest within until the very end. When Narcissus, Claudius's freedman, confronted her with evidence of her secret marriage, even then her eyes did not falter. She met his gaze with unflinching defiance, her pupils sharp as obsidian. To the last, she wielded them as weapons, refusing to let fear show. Those who saw her in that moment carried the memory of her gaze for the rest of their lives, haunted by its mixture of arrogance and despair. In the gardens where her downfall was sealed, Messalina's eyes looked one last time upon the roses. Perhaps they reflected the crimson petals, perhaps they reflected her own blood yet to spill. Witnesses claimed she did not weep, nor beg, but her eyes lingered on life itself, drinking in the beauty of a world that had both crowned and condemned her. That final gaze, they said, was one of terrible clarity. Her executioners, hardened men accustomed to violence, hesitated under her gaze. They claimed afterward that her eyes unnerved them, that they felt seen, weighed, and judged in that single instant. It was as though the Empress herself became immortal in that moment, her spirit preserved in the depth of her pupils, even as her body crumbled. Her eyes, they swore, were the last thing they remembered before striking. Rome never forgot the Empress's eyes. Poets wrote of them in lines heavy with longing, historians recorded them with warnings, and commoners whispered of them in markets long after her death. To some, they were jewels of beauty unmatched, to others, daggers cloaked in velvet. Yet to all, they remained unforgettable, as if the Empress still lingered, watching from shadows. And so Messalina's legacy endured, not only in the scrolls of history or the scandals of her life, but in the memory of her gaze. Eyes that seduced, betrayed, and condemned. Eyes that reflected both love and lust, loyalty and treachery. Eyes that belonged to a woman who turned the palace into her web and Rome into her stage. The Empress's eyes remained eternal, shimmering in the dark corners of memory, long after her breath had ceased. The palace was not built of stone and marble alone, it was stitched together with whispers. Rumors drifted through its corridors like threads upon a loom, weaving patterns invisible to the eye yet strong enough to strangle or crown. Messalina understood this better than most. She was not merely a player in Rome's theatre of power, she was its weaver, tugging at loose strands until they formed tapestries of her design. A glance here, a murmured word there, and soon the halls vibrated with stories too compelling to ignore. Rumors began in shadows, spoken by lips that pretended to stay loyal while betraying with each syllable. A servant polishing bronze might murmur to another about the late-night footsteps he had heard. A guard stationed at a doorway might whisper of silk curtains shifting when no wind blew. Each tale was small, fragile as a spider's thread, yet when joined together they created webs too strong to escape. Messalina's name traveled within them, bright and dark alike, her legend growing with every retelling. Sometimes the rumors carried the scent of scandal, of lovers hidden in gardens, of embraces beneath torchlight, of clandestine feasts where laughter was too free. Sometimes they bore the promise of influence, Messalina persuading senators, Messalina arranging futures with a smile, Messalina's touch opening doors thought sealed. These stories spread faster than truth, for Rome craved the taste of intrigue more than bread or wine. The empire fed itself on gossip, and she provided the feast. Messalina herself knew the value of feeding the loom. She whispered carefully, never clumsily, planting seeds that bloomed into rumors others believed they had birthed themselves. A sigh in the presence of a senator might lead to tales of her disapproval. A faint smile toward a soldier could ignite stories of secret favor. She never needed to command openly when rumors carried her intentions with greater force than decrees. She was both the spinner of threads and the shadow at the loom. The loom stretched beyond the palace into the city itself. Market vendors repeated tales with laughter, not knowing they spread her influence as surely as senators in marble halls. Housewives leaned from balconies, trading stories as if they were spices. Children even played games where they imitated the empress, their voices high and mocking, never realizing that their mimicry ensured her immortality. Rome's streets became an extension of her web, each rumor another thread binding her to the people. Yet rumors were double-edged threads, weaving both triumph and peril. As easily as she spun glory, others spun treachery. Rivals planted whispers of her betrayal, of her disloyalty to Claudius, of her ambition to wear more than jewels. These rumors crawled like ants, small and irritating, until their numbers became overwhelming. Messalina had always thrived in the chaos of gossip, but even she could not always tell which threads she had woven and which had been placed to ensnare her. Her enemies understood the loom's power as she did. Narcissus, Claudius's freedman, was especially skilled at twisting whispers into weapons. He gathered tales like firewood, waiting until the time was right to ignite them. He knew that Rome would believe almost anything if dressed with drama, and Messalina's very nature made her the perfect subject. Her beauty, her ambition, her indulgence all gave her enemies the material to weave her downfall. Still, she resisted, her fingers deft upon the threads. In her chambers, beneath the glow of oil lamps, she strategized which rumors to let grow wild and which to silence with sudden acts of kindness or cruelty. If the people whispered she was cruel, she appeared in public with her children, soft and maternal. If they whispered she was weak, she summoned soldiers and watched them kneel. She stitched her image anew each day, never allowing one pattern to dominate for long. The senators, too, fell into the rhythm of her loom. They whispered of her extravagance even as they sought her favor. They cursed her ambition in public, yet in private they begged for her gaze. Their hypocrisy made them perfect threads, pliable, breakable, easy to weave. Messalina delighted in their contradictions, knowing that rumors had made them puppets more effectively than any chain of command. In the gardens, where roses bloomed and fountains sang, Rumor's loom thrived most vividly. Lovers and conspirators alike gathered under the same shadows, each fearing their own whispers might be overheard. Messalina's presence here was theatrical. She strolled among the hedges as though unaware of the voices behind her, yet every rustle reached her ears. The gardens became a loom within a loom, a place where desire and fear tangled into endless patterns. The slaves carried the threads more swiftly than any senator. A word dropped in a kitchen, a sigh overheard in the stables, a furtive look noticed in the baths, all found their way into the Empress's web. She rewarded the loyal with favors and punished the careless with silence or dismissal, both equally feared. In truth, the slaves were her most powerful loom workers, binding together the palace with invisible cords that strengthened or strangled at her will. As Rome indulged in festivals, the loom grew louder, swelling with tales of Messalina's excess. Her appetite for pleasure became myth, each retelling amplifying until truth dissolved. Some said she competed with prostitutes in hidden games of endurance, others that she held feasts where morals dissolved like sugar in wine. She did not always deny these tales, sometimes she even encouraged them, for scandal was another kind of power. To be whispered about endlessly was to remain unforgettable. But power fed by rumor carried its poison. Claudius, so long blind to the whispers, began to hear them too often to ignore. Though he trusted Messalina, his ears grew heavy with tales. Senators leaned closer, servants hesitated before speaking, freedmen carried anxious glances. Each rumor tightened the loom around her, no longer threads she controlled but cords drawing her toward judgment. She felt the tension growing, each day a little stronger, each whisper a little louder. Messalina's enemies wove their threads with cunning precision. They knew she had grown reliant on the loom, and so they used it to strangle her. Rumors of her secret marriage to Gaius Silius spread like wildfire, impossible to contain. Whether truth or invention, it mattered little once spoken. Rome itself became the loom now, its people weaving the tale into inevitability. No denial could unravel what so many tongues had bound together. In her final days, Messalina walked the palace with eyes sharp and restless, as if she could see the threads tightening. She had once danced among whispers, pulling them to her rhythm, but now the music had changed. The corridors that once carried her name with or now hummed with malice. The loom she had mastered turned against her, weaving her downfall with the same relentless artistry she had once commanded. Yet even as the threads closed around her, she fought. She summoned allies, begged favors, tried to spin new stories that might unravel the old. But the loom was no longer hers. It belonged to Narcissus, to the senators, to the people of Rome, each adding their stitch of betrayal. The rumors had become a tapestry of her guilt, and no hand could unpick what so many had woven together. The night before her end, Messalina sat by the dim glow of a single lamp, her hands restless upon silken cushions. She thought of all the stories told in her name, some true, many false, all powerful. She wondered if Rome would remember her as monster or muse, villain or victim. Perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was that she would be remembered, her name stitched forever into the empire's tapestry of rumor and history. The loom of rumor outlasted her body. Even as she fell, whispers rose higher, spinning new tales about her final breath. Some said she begged for mercy, others that she stood proud and defiant. Some swore her last gaze was at Claudius's absent shadow, others that it lingered on roses wet with dawn. The truth vanished within the stories, leaving only threads that shimmered with contradiction. Rome itself thrived on such contradictions. It needed its villains as much as its heroes, its scandals as much as its triumphs. Messalina became both, the loom weaving her into every corner of the city's imagination. Children born long after her death would hear her name and whisper it with awe or disdain, never knowing the full truth, but always knowing the legend. The loom of rumor never ceased its weaving. In every palace that followed, in every court where ambition festered, the threads of Messalina's story returned. She became a lesson, a warning, a myth embroidered into the fabric of empire. Her presence lingered not in statues or decrees but in the whispered stories that outlived marble and gold. She had become eternal in the only way Rome truly honored, through rumor. And so, as dawn rose upon the empire, the loom continued, spinning new tales for new rulers, binding new victims in its endless patterns. But always, beneath the hum of fresh whispers, one name remained, a constant thread woven through every design: Messalina. The empress who had lived and died by rumor's loom, her fate forever tangled in the whispers she once commanded. The morning unfurled with a softness that seemed almost complicit in the secrets it cloaked. The air of Rome was thick with autumn sweetness, carrying the perfume of ripened grapes and freshly pressed olive oil from distant estates. But within the hidden chambers of Messalina's heart, a storm gathered. She had chosen this day not for love's purity but for love's defiance, a ceremony woven not by gods but by mortal hands, against the sanctity of her emperor husband. The garden would become the stage of her audacity, a marriage beneath the shadow of treason. The imperial gardens had always whispered of old mysteries, fountains spilling into marble basins, roses blooming year-round, and sculptures of gods poised in silent witness. On this day, they were dressed with care, as though the earth itself conspired to lend Messalina her veil of legitimacy. Laurel branches intertwined with wild ivy framed the columns, while scattered petals carpeted the path she would soon walk. The sun dappled through the leaves, casting moving shadows that seemed restless, unable to decide if they belonged to beauty or betrayal. Messalina herself appeared like a vision, her gown of pale silk stitched with golden threads, glistening faintly in the early light. Her veil, long and translucent, caught on the breeze, giving her the semblance of a goddess descending into mortal affairs. Those who had gathered, the courtiers loyal to her, the allies bribed or seduced into silence, saw not an empress committing treachery, but a woman claiming destiny. Every fold of her garment spoke of defiance. Every jewel on her wrists glittered as though mocking the crown of Claudius. Beside her, Gaius Silius waited, handsome and broad-shouldered, his tunic edged with crimson, his face caught between triumph and dread. Though ambition had steered him here, though desire for Messalina had quickened his steps, he was not blind to the precipice before them. Still, when their eyes met, it was not fear that prevailed but a strange intoxication. To wed the empress while the emperor lived was madness, and yet the garden smelled of eternity, as though time itself bent to witness their embrace. The priest who performed the rites did so with trembling hands, yet his voice held firm. Ancient words rose into the stillness, carrying a weight that bound them not only to each other but to a fate heavy with consequence. The witnesses leaned forward as the vows were exchanged, sensing the gravity of what they condoned. It was not just a wedding, it was an act of usurpation, an audacious rewriting of Rome's order. Every syllable of the ritual seemed to ring louder than intended, echoing as though carried straight to the ears of absent gods. As the rites concluded, the guests lifted their cups, not in innocent celebration but in conspiratorial solidarity. Wine poured like blood into golden goblets, and each sip tasted of both sweetness and poison. The laughter that followed was cautious, tinged with unease, yet fueled by the intoxicating vision of rebellion made flesh. For some, the wine dulled the edge of fear, for others, it sharpened awareness of the impossible gamble unfolding before them. Still, none dared to abandon the feast, for they had already tied their fortunes to Messalina's star. Musicians played soft melodies, their lyres and flutes weaving threads of fragile joy into the gathering. The notes rose like fragile prayers, seeking to disguise the weight of the moment, yet the music could not drown the unspoken questions that filled the air. Could such a union survive in the shadow of the emperor's throne? Could Messalina's beauty, her cunning, her relentless will, outpace the wrath of Claudius once the veil of secrecy was pierced? Even as garlands crowned the couple, the instruments seemed to falter on the edge of foreboding. Messalina's laughter carried across the garden, a sound too bright, too rehearsed, like sunlight forcing itself through clouds. She leaned into Silius with gestures of intimacy, her hand brushing his arm, her lips curving into smiles that seemed etched by both love and calculation. To her companions, she was radiant; to herself, she was untouchable. She had rewritten the script of her life, crowning herself not merely as empress but as sovereign of her desires. Yet, beneath her composure, a silent awareness lingered. Rome was not so easily deceived. At the edges of the gathering, some whispered doubts. Courtiers who had come for spectacle exchanged glances heavy with suspicion. They had known Messalina's boldness, but this was audacity beyond measure. To wed while still bound to Claudius was not merely scandal, it was treason. Their murmurs slithered like snakes beneath the music, words twisted with fear of what would follow. Still, none dared speak aloud. For now, silence was safer than truth, and silence became the uninvited guest of the ceremony. Silius, though proud, bore a shadow across his face. Even in the glow of the garden, even with Messalina at his side, his thoughts drifted to the future that loomed like a mountain ahead. Was this union a bridge to power or a march into ruin? He knew that Claudius, though pliant, was not without loyal advisers. The emperor's freedmen, shrewd and watchful, were not blind men. Could they truly believe that such a spectacle would remain hidden? Still, desire overcame calculation, and when Messalina's hand clasped his, he silenced his doubts with the warmth of her touch. The feast continued with roasted meats, sweet fruits, and honeyed wine, as though to mimic the grandeur of imperial banquets. Yet it was a feast without the emperor, and that absence hung in the air like a curse. Each toast raised felt like a dangerous echo, each clink of goblets like the striking of a clock counting down. Messalina basked in the revelry, her laughter lifting, her beauty casting a spell, but the shadows in the corners grew darker, stretching as the day waned. As twilight fell, torches were lit, casting the garden in a golden glow that only heightened its unreality. Flames flickered against the marble statues, which seemed to watch with disapproval. Venus herself, carved in stone, gazed upon the scene with cold eyes, as if shamed by the farce unfolding. The air thickened with smoke and perfume, mingling sweetness with suffocation. The wedding had been completed, the vows spoken, the feast shared, but the silence of Rome beyond the walls loomed heavier than any blessing within them. Messalina rose from her seat, lifting her cup one final time, her voice cutting through the murmur of the guests. She declared herself reborn, not bound by fear or tradition, but by the law of her own desires. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then swelling as loyalty demanded compliance. Yet beneath the clamor, hearts beat faster, not from devotion but from dread. For in that proclamation, Messalina had confessed not only her power but her folly, branding herself as Rome's most dangerous woman. The torches burned lower, and the guests began to disperse into the corridors of the palace and beyond. They left with smiles fixed upon their faces, but their eyes betrayed unease. Each knew that they carried a dangerous secret in their silence. Some resolved to keep it buried, others plotted how best to wield it. But all understood one thing: the garden wedding had planted seeds that would either bloom into a new order or choke them all in ruin. Silius lingered with Messalina after the feast, his gaze fixed on the horizon where dawn would soon return. He touched her hand and spoke words of reassurance, yet his heart trembled with the awareness that they had crossed into territory no man could truly command. He had wedded ambition itself, a bride whose beauty veiled catastrophe. The warmth of her smile comforted him, but in the recesses of his soul, he wondered if love with Messalina was love at all or merely the intoxication of sharing in her defiance. Messalina, however, felt no such hesitation. To her, the night was victory. She had bent Rome's traditions to her will, cloaked herself in the sanctity of marriage while committing sacrilege. Her confidence was intoxicating, her faith in her invincibility unwavering. She envisioned herself as untouchable, her beauty a shield, her cunning a weapon. To her, the emperor was but a shadow, easily dismissed. In her mind, she had claimed more than a lover, she had claimed her sovereignty. Yet even as she retired from the garden, the night air whispered warnings. The ivy rustled against the columns, the fountains gurgled with uneasy song, and the statues seemed to lean closer, as if eager to report what they had seen. Rome was a city of whispers, and secrets were never truly buried. The garden wedding would not remain confined to its marble borders. Somewhere beyond the walls, truth already stretched its wings, preparing to fly into the ears of Claudius. The palace corridors were quiet as Messalina and Silius retreated, their steps echoing softly. Servants bowed but their eyes lingered, curiosity simmering behind their silence. They, too, had witnessed enough to speak volumes if they chose. Messalina, unshaken, carried herself with the ease of a goddess, while Silius walked beside her with the air of a man who knew that shadows were gathering. Their union was sealed, but their fate was far from secured. In the stillness of the night, Rome itself seemed to listen. The Tiber flowed quietly, but its waters carried stories, as they always had. The city's alleys and forums, its taverns and temples, thrummed with invisible currents of rumor waiting to swell. What had been spoken in the secrecy of the garden would soon find voice in the streets. The wedding was not merely a moment, it was a stone cast into the river, sending ripples that would reach the emperor's throne. The stars above shone faintly, scattered like witnesses too far to intervene. Messalina gazed at them with pride, imagining herself destined among their ranks. She saw only her brilliance reflected, her triumph confirmed. Yet the same stars looked down upon Claudius, upon Narcissus, upon those who would soon weave this tale into accusation. The cosmos did not favor Messalina's vanity, nor did it conspire in her defiance. It merely observed, impartial and eternal. The night deepened, and with it, the illusion of safety. Messalina lay her head upon soft pillows, content in her conquest, while Silius lingered, restless with the burden of his choice. Outside, Rome did not sleep. The city's breath was 1,000 whispers, its pulse quickened by scandal it had not yet fully spoken. Tomorrow, the walls would begin to echo with suspicion. Tomorrow, silence would fracture. But tonight, within the scented shadows of the garden's memory, the empress believed herself invincible. The dawn crept into Rome like an uneasy guest, the pale light pressing through marble colonnades as if reluctant to expose what had transpired in shadowed gardens. The whispers had already begun to stir, faint as the rustle of silk, but undeniable. In the taverns and atriums, in the corners of palaces where servants bent their heads low, the name of Messalina was paired with scandal. A wedding had been spoken of, though none dared speak it too loudly yet. Still, rumor is a flame, and even the smallest spark can consume an empire. Messalina woke to this new day with no tremor in her step, her silk robes trailing across polished floors, her hair adorned with pearls that caught the light like stars. She believed the world bent to her beauty, that her cunning could weave any lie into truth if spoken with conviction. To her, the night before was not peril but triumph, a daring rewriting of fate itself. Yet beneath the surface, forces were stirring, men with sharper minds than she credited, watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when threads pulled too tightly could not be loosed. Claudius, her husband, still wore the mask of oblivion, a man distracted by duties of state and rituals of tradition. His eyes, though gentle, often seemed clouded, as though half asleep to the intrigues swirling around him. But Messalina underestimated not only his freedmen but the city itself. Rome was not blind, Rome was 1,000 eyes, 1,000 mouths, each ready to devour scandal. The empress believed herself invincible within the marble walls of the palace, yet the city outside was already weaving her downfall. Narcissus, the emperor's loyal secretary, was among those who heard the first murmurs. His ear was trained for treachery, his mind sharpened by years of survival in a court where a wrong word could cost one his life. At first, he dismissed the whispers as exaggerations, Rome's endless appetite for gossip. But as the details sharpened the garden, the vows, the feast, his heart clenched. He knew Messalina's appetite for indulgence, but this was something more. This was no dalliance. This was treason, dressed in silk. Meanwhile, Messalina paraded herself as though untouched by suspicion, entertaining allies and flattering senators with honeyed words. She laughed as though Rome itself bent to her joy, and for a moment, perhaps it did. Her presence commanded rooms, her beauty clouded judgment. But no performance can forever silence the tension that grows beneath. For each smile she offered, there was a shadow of doubt in the minds of those who remembered the vows she had exchanged, the ring placed upon her finger that should never have been. Silius, her new husband in all but law, bore the strain more heavily. His steps grew slower, his eyes darted to corners, his words carried hesitation. For he knew what it meant to stand in defiance of an emperor, even one as pliant as Claudius. The men of Rome might whisper now, but soon they would shout. And once the truth reached the emperor's ears, no charm of Messalina's, no strength of his, could halt the avalanche. Yet, he remained by her side, bound by desire and ambition, a moth circling a flame too fierce to resist. The senators who had attended the garden wedding found themselves caught in an invisible snare. Their silence had seemed wise that night, But with daylight came the recognition that silence itself was treachery. Some paced their villas with restless steps, wondering whether to confess, whether to run, or whether to gamble their fates upon Messalina's survival. Each had tied themselves to her cause, willingly or not, and now the noose tightened with every rumor carried by slaves and servants to the city's ears. Within the palace, even the slaves whispered, their eyes darting as they passed messages from one corridor to another. Rome's lower ranks thrived on the secrets of the powerful, and the empress's secret was too rich to contain. A guard spoke to a cook, a maid to a courier, and the story spread with the quiet inevitability of water flowing downhill. Messalina's veil of power was strong, but the voices beneath it multiplied until even the marble walls could not contain their sound. At first, Claudius remained unaware, his days filled with petitions and rituals, his evenings with simple meals and solemn conversation. But slowly, fragments of the truth were delivered to him, each detail sharpening the image he refused to see. A wedding, they said. With Silius. In the gardens. A feast attended by senators. At first, Claudius laughed nervously, dismissing it as idle malice. But when the same words reached him again and again, spoken by different mouths with trembling certainty, the threads began to tighten around his trust. Messalina, sensing none of this, carried on her charade with pride. She summoned musicians, she entertained poets, she wandered the gardens as though the marble statues applauded her audacity. Yet in quiet moments, when the laughter faded and the music dimmed, she could not entirely banish the gnawing sensation that eyes followed her more closely, that silence deepened when she entered a room. Still, she smothered the thought with wine and flattery, refusing to accept that her triumph might already be turning to dust. Silius, however, grew restless. His ambitions had been bold, but now he saw clearly the danger closing in. He urged Messalina to act, to seize the emperor's throne outright, to make their union unassailable. But Messalina, blinded by vanity, dismissed his urgency. She believed in the strength of her beauty, the power of her charms, as though those weapons could parry steel or silence the law. Her confidence, once intoxicating, began to weigh upon him like a stone, dragging him into inevitability. The whispers reached Narcissus again, this time from a senator whose face was pale with fear. He described the wedding in detail, the garlands, the vows, the priest's trembling hands. Each word was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry too undeniable to ignore. Narcissus carried it to Claudius, his voice steady though his heart raced. He knew the danger of revealing such betrayal, the risk of disbelief, the wrath of the empress. Yet he also knew that delay meant disaster. Claudius listened, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. Could it be? His wife, the empress, mother of his children, joined in marriage to another. His hands shook as he set down his cup, his lips fumbling for words that never came. He wished to dismiss it, to laugh it away, but the details struck too deeply. The names of the guests, the presence of senators, the whispers of slaves all aligned too closely. The emperor's trust began to unravel, and in its place, a quiet dread took root. Still, Claudius hesitated. His nature was cautious, slow to anger, eager to avoid rashness. But in that hesitation lay danger. For each moment he delayed, Messalina carried on her revels, unknowing of the storm gathering beyond her sight. Silius pressed her again, desperate to act before the emperor's doubt solidified into certainty. Yet she laughed him away, convinced the emperor would remain blind, convinced that her beauty and power were shields against any blade. The court, once loyal in silence, grew restless. Some whispered of fleeing, others of betraying her to save themselves. The feast that had once seemed a triumph now revealed itself as a snare. Messalina's allies began to peel away, their smiles thinner, their loyalty fraying. Each sought to preserve themselves, to find safety in betrayal before it was too late. The threads of her web, once tight and glistening, began to strain under their own weight. As the tension grew, Narcissus urged Claudius to act swiftly, to seize the empress before her plots consumed the empire. He painted the danger in stark colors, Messalina and Silius plotting to take the throne, the senators complicit, Rome at risk of civil unrest. Claudius trembled beneath the weight of choice, torn between the love he still bore and the truth that threatened to crush him. The emperor's heart was soft, But the empire demanded iron. The decision could not be delayed forever. Messalina, blind to the tightening snare, continued her charade of joy. She hosted another feast, her laughter echoing beneath vaulted ceilings, her beauty cloaked in jewels and silk. Yet the guests smiled with forced mirth, their eyes darting nervously, their laughter brittle. The music rang hollow, the wine soured on their tongues. They knew, even if she did not, that the night was nearly over, that the dawn would bring reckoning. The statues in the garden stood silent witnesses, their stone faces unchanging as the world shifted around them. They had seen emperors rise and fall, lovers embrace and betray, vows sworn and broken. Now, they seemed to lean closer, as though eager to watch the downfall they knew was inevitable. Their silence was heavier than any shout, their stillness a reminder that history records not triumphs alone but follies too. In the city, the whispers grew louder, carrying from taverns to forums, from slaves to senators. Rome itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, a living organism that fed upon scandal, that thrived on the fall of the mighty. The story of the empress's wedding spread like fire in dry fields, leaping from tongue to tongue until none could escape its heat. The people laughed, the people gossiped, but beneath their amusement lay a dangerous truth: an empire cannot bear two thrones. Claudius, weary and afraid, sought counsel again from Narcissus. The freedman pressed him, speaking not only of treason but of survival. If the emperor did not act, he would be the one cast aside, humiliated, undone. Claudius listened, tears of disbelief glistening in his eyes, his heart wrenched between love and fear. He longed to believe in his wife's innocence, but the threads had pulled too taut, and now they cut into his flesh. The emperor at last began to see the truth he wished to ignore. Messalina, in her chambers, gazed into polished bronze mirrors, admiring the reflection of her beauty. She saw not fear, not betrayal, but only the face of a woman untouchable. She whispered to herself of triumph, of destiny, of love turned to empire. Yet outside her doors, the threads wound tighter still, weaving a trap that no beauty could escape. Her reflection smiled back at her, serene and certain, while fate itself loomed like a shadow at her shoulder. And so, the stage was set. The garden wedding had been the first knot, the whispers the next, the doubts of senators another. Now the emperor himself stood at the edge, trembling yet resolute, guided by those who saw more clearly than he. Rome, restless and hungry, awaited the breaking of silence, the clash between love and law. The threads, once spun by Messalina's cunning, had become her cage, and with each passing moment, they pulled tighter, ready to strangle even an empress. The night descended upon Rome with a chill sharper than usual, as though the city itself sensed the weight of an unseen verdict. The lamps along the palace corridors flickered uncertainly, their flames swaying as if reluctant to bear witness. Messalina, still draped in silks and gems, lounged with the confidence of a woman untouchable, blind to the noose tightening around her. Yet beyond her chambers, men whispered and plotted, their steps heavy with resolve, their voices low with the gravity of what must come. Claudius sat in uneasy silence, his cup of watered wine untouched before him. The laughter of past evenings seemed far away, replaced by a cold stillness that pressed against his chest. His hands trembled on the armrests of his chair as the words of Narcissus echoed in his mind: treason, betrayal, conspiracy. To believe such a thing was agony, but to dismiss it was peril. The emperor, so often hesitant, felt the weight of decision finally pressing like iron upon his weary shoulders. Narcissus stood near, his expression unreadable, though inside his heart raced. He had gambled everything in telling the emperor the truth, risking his life if disbelief had prevailed. Now, he saw the struggle playing out within Claudius, the man torn between love and law, between the woman he had cherished and the empire he must guard. Narcissus pressed his advantage gently but firmly, reminding the emperor that hesitation was itself a sentence of death if not for him, then for Rome. The emperor's freedmen gathered as the night deepened, their faces grave, their voices hushed. Some counseled mercy, others justice, but all agreed the empress's actions could no longer be hidden. Claudius's mind swung like a pendulum between them, each suggestion cutting deeper than the last. To punish Messalina was to sever his own heart, yet to pardon her was to surrender his crown. The air grew thick with indecision, and even the shadows seemed to lean closer, waiting for the judgment that would soon fall. Messalina remained unaware of the finality building around her. She still believed in her charm, in her ability to twist fear into desire and doubt into loyalty. She spoke sweetly to those near her, promising feasts and pleasures, mocking the dullness of her absent husband. To her, Claudius was a fool who would never awaken, a puppet she could guide with tears and kisses if need arose. But her faith in her invincibility was a fragile shield, soon to shatter beneath the hammer of truth. Silius, however, was less blind. He paced in his chambers, restless as a caged beast, aware that their time was nearly over. He urged his companions to act, to seize power before Claudius struck, but none would follow. The senators who had once toasted in the garden now hid behind silence, unwilling to die for a dream already unraveling. Silius knew, with a sinking weight, that his fate was sealed. The sentence was already written, only the hour of its reading remained. Claudius, weary and uncertain, at last allowed himself to hear the truth without resistance. Narcissus pressed the final blow, a vivid recounting of the wedding, the priest's trembling voice, the vows spoken beneath the eyes of Rome. The emperor's face grew pale, his lips trembling with disbelief. He muttered denials, half-formed words of refusal, but his eyes betrayed the collapse of hope. Messalina had not merely strayed, she had declared him obsolete. And for an emperor, there is no wound more fatal. In the quiet of that chamber, Claudius's hesitation broke. He whispered words of judgment, reluctant but unshakable. Messalina must die. The freedman nodded gravely, the decision like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples reaching through every corner of the palace. It was no longer rumor, no longer doubt. It was decree. And with decree came finality, the kind that no plea of beauty or promise of change could undo. The sentence had been passed, though the empress still laughed in ignorance. Messalina's children slept in nearby rooms, unaware that their world was crumbling in silence. The innocence of their dreams stood in cruel contrast to the storm gathering beyond their doors. For in the name of Rome, their mother would be condemned, and their lives would forever bear the shadow of her fall. The gods themselves seemed to turn their gaze away, unwilling to witness what must be done. The stars, distant and impartial, watched the unraveling with cold light. Narcissus took the responsibility upon himself to carry out the will of the emperor. He left Claudius in his chamber, trembling and broken, unable to face the act directly. The freedman moved with grim resolve, summoning soldiers and messengers, their armor clinking softly in the midnight corridors. Each man understood the gravity of the mission, yet none spoke a word. Silence was safer than thought, obedience safer than doubt. The night air grew heavier as they prepared to hunt an empress. Messalina, still cloaked in vanity, sensed a shift too late. When Narcissus arrived with soldiers at her door, her laughter faltered, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. She greeted him with feigned confidence, demanding to see Claudius, certain that she could melt his resolve with tears. But Narcissus did not falter. He looked at her with the cold eyes of a man who carried a sentence, not a message. His words were simple, his tone final. The emperor no longer wished to see her. The realization struck Messalina like a blade. Her face drained of color, her body trembling beneath layers of silk. For the first time in years, her beauty seemed powerless, her words lodged in her throat as though even her tongue betrayed her. She pleaded still, demanding her children, begging for an audience, but Narcissus shook his head. The emperor had spoken, and no veil of charm could cover the decree. Her tears fell, but they fell upon stone. She was led through the gardens where once she had feasted with Silius, the same marble paths now echoing with the footsteps of soldiers instead of music. The roses that had once crowned her triumph now mocked her in silence, their petals falling as though in mourning. Each step brought her closer to the end, yet she clung desperately to hope, whispering to herself that Claudius would relent, that his love would break the chain of judgment. But the night did not answer. In the dim torchlight, Messalina's mind raced. She thought of the emperor's face, of his softness, his hesitation. Surely he would spare her, surely Narcissus lied. She imagined bursting into his chamber, her tears staining his hands, her cries forcing him to recall the warmth they had once shared. But the corridors did not lead to Claudius, they led away, into the silence of the gardens where the sentence awaited its fulfillment. She had written her fate, and now it was being read aloud by the night. The soldiers, grim and efficient, gave her no chance to escape. They formed a wall of steel around her, their eyes fixed ahead, avoiding her gaze. To them, she was no longer empress but condemned, no longer untouchable but mortal. Each man understood the weight of what they carried, yet none dared falter. Rome demanded obedience, and their loyalty was not to her but to the decree that had sealed her doom. Their silence was heavier than any words. Messalina's voice grew shrill, her pleas louder, her desperation breaking through the mask she had worn for so long. She begged for mercy, for time, for forgiveness, but the words dissolved into the night air, unanswered. The torches flickered, the fountains gurgled, the marble statues stared. The city that had once bent to her will now ignored her cries. For all her power, she was now nothing more than a woman led to judgment. Narcissus, though resolute, felt a flicker of unease. He had seen many betrayals, many falls, but none so steep as this. Messalina had soared too high, and now she fell with a swiftness that even he found cruel. Yet he did not relent. His loyalty was to Rome, not to pity. The emperor's heart might waver, but Narcissus knew the empire could not. He steeled himself against her tears, guiding the soldiers forward until hesitation was no longer possible. The night thickened as they reached the place prepared for her. It was no grand arena, no stage for spectacle. It was a quiet corner of the gardens, shadowed by trees, chosen for its silence. There would be no crowd to witness her fall, no audience to marvel at her beauty undone. Only the torches, the soldiers, and the freedman stood as witnesses. The sentence of Rome was not always shouted, sometimes it was whispered into the night, as though ashamed of its necessity. Messalina's body shook as the truth at last settled into her bones. She begged once more for her children, for Claudius, for life itself, but her words had lost their power. The soldiers waited, their faces hard, their hands steady. Narcissus gave the order, his voice low but unyielding. There was no turning back, no appeal, no chance to delay. The night had been patient, but patience had run out. The Empress of Rome would end here, among the roses that had crowned her betrayal. Her final moments were a storm of terror and disbelief. She had lived as though untouchable, weaving desire into power, turning men into pawns. Now, stripped of pretense, she was only flesh and fear, trembling in the dark. Her cries faded into silence as the soldiers carried out their grim task, swift and merciless. The torches flickered once more, their flames bending in the breeze as though sighing with relief. The sentence had been spoken, and it had been fulfilled. In the distance, Claudius sat alone, unaware that his wife's life had already been ended. His freedman had kept the act from him, knowing his heart might falter at the final moment. He sipped his wine with trembling hands, muttering to himself of mercy, of love, of betrayal. Perhaps he would have spared her, perhaps not, but the choice had been taken from him. By dawn, he would wake to the truth, his heart broken yet his empire preserved. Rome itself seemed to shift with the weight of the act. The whispers that had carried the story of Messalina's betrayal now carried the story of her fall. The city drank in the scandal like wine, retelling it with relish, twisting it with embellishment. But beneath the gossip lay a somber truth: even beauty, even power, cannot escape the hand of justice when the empire itself is threatened. Messalina had played too boldly, and the game had claimed her. Narcissus lingered for a moment after the soldiers dispersed, staring at the stillness left behind. He felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only the heavy certainty that Rome was safer tonight than it had been the night before. He turned away at last, his steps measured, his face unreadable. History would record this night in whispers, but he knew it would echo far louder than any feast or victory. The Empress had fallen, and with her fall, the empire had reminded all who lived within it that no one, not even a queen, stood above its will. The statues in the garden stood silent, bathed in torchlight, their marble faces cold as ever. They had watched her wedding, they had watched her fall, and they would watch countless others after. For Rome endured, though its players came and went, their triumphs fleeting, their follies immortalized only in stone and story. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals drifting across the ground where she had stood. Beauty lingered, but the woman who had wielded it was gone. When dawn broke, the sky was streaked with crimson, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to the night's grim decree. The city awoke to gossip, to shock, to laughter, to mourning. Some wept, others rejoiced, but all agreed on one truth: Messalina's story had ended not with a feast but with a sentence spoken in the night. Rome marched on, indifferent, eternal, its empire preserved at the cost of a woman who had believed herself untouchable. The city of Rome woke to the news as if to the tolling of a bell, though no bells rang in truth. Word of Messalina's fall spread through alleys and markets like a sudden gust of wind, carrying with it both disbelief and vindication. Merchants whispered as they arranged their stalls, children repeated fragments of overheard gossip, and senators strode into chambers with carefully arranged expressions of solemnity, though behind their eyes burned a mixture of satisfaction and fear. Claudius sat alone in the dawn, his eyes swollen from sleeplessness, his hands trembling over the folds of his tunic. He had not seen her final moments, his freedman had spared him that, but the knowledge gnawed at him nonetheless. He wondered if her last thought had been of him, of their children, or if she had clung even then to her lover, Silius. The silence in his chambers was heavier than chains, and every breath reminded him of the absence he himself had ordered. The freedmen gathered cautiously, measuring their words before they spoke. Narcissus stood foremost, his face calm but his mind calculating the repercussions. They had preserved the emperor, preserved Rome itself, yet in doing so they had carved a wound into Claudius's heart that might never heal. He watched the emperor with care, ready to press him toward strength, for weakness now could invite the very chaos they had sought to avert. Messalina's shadow lingered even in death. In the Senate, voices carried with more vigor than usual. Some praised the emperor's decisiveness, others whispered about the dangerous sway of freedmen, and a few dared to mourn the empress in veiled words. None could deny, however, that Rome had shifted overnight. The tale of the garden wedding had become a parable of hubris, told and retold with each repetition sharpening the blade of ridicule. Senators who had toasted Silius now distanced themselves, swearing loyalty with louder voices than before. Among the people, opinions splintered. Some cursed Messalina's name as though she had been a curse upon the empire itself, a woman too greedy for power and pleasure. Others pitied her, recalling her beauty, her youth, and the way she had once enchanted the city. But none could ignore the fascination of her downfall. Rome thrived on spectacle, and though her death had been silent, the story of it was louder than any triumphal procession. The aftershocks rippled through every household. The children of Claudius and Messalina became the most fragile victims of the night's decree. Britannicus, young and still unaware of the machinery of power, looked to his father with confusion, unable to grasp why his mother no longer came to him. The silence in their chambers was pierced only by muffled sobs and unanswered questions. Claudius avoided his son's eyes, ashamed of his own weakness and of the truth he could not yet explain. Innocence suffered most in the wake of power's cruelty. Messalina's name lingered in the air like a forbidden song. Poets would not dare write of her openly, but in the corners of taverns, verses were whispered, some condemning, some yearning. To some, she was a monster of appetite, to others, she was a victim of ambition, crushed beneath the weight of Rome's expectations. The truth, as always, was too tangled for simple judgment, but Rome did not hunger for truth. It hungered for stories, and Messalina's was too vivid to fade quickly. Claudius's heart bore the heaviest strain. He tried to focus on edicts, on trials, on the endless demands of empire, but every parchment blurred before his eyes. He remembered her laughter, the way she had touched his shoulder at feasts, the words she had whispered to soothe his doubts. Were they lies from the start? Or had there been moments of sincerity buried within her games? The emperor could not answer, and the uncertainty was as cruel as any blade. Narcissus reminded him often that the empire had been preserved, that hesitation would have meant ruin, yet Claudius found no comfort in victory. For what is victory when it requires the death of one you once called beloved? He felt the paradox pressing against his chest. He had been both betrayed and preserved by her fall. Rome demanded sacrifice, and it had taken his heart as offering. The emperor lived on, but not without the mark of a scar too deep to conceal. The palace servants moved in hushed tones, for even their gossip seemed dangerous now. They had once feared Messalina's wrath, now they feared the silence left in her absence. Her chambers were sealed, her gowns and jewels hidden away, her name spoken only in whispers. Yet the emptiness itself seemed to accuse them, as if every marble column and gilded wall still remembered her footsteps. The palace had lost its queen, but not its memory of her. Beyond the walls, the people carried her tale into every corner of Rome. Bread sellers recounted the audacity of the garden wedding, while fishermen spoke of her arrogance as though it had cursed the river itself. Some compared her to the heroines of tragedy, undone by desire and ambition. Others mocked her as a cautionary figure, proof that women could not be trusted with too much power. Every telling distorted her, stretching her humanity into myth, but myths are what Rome devoured best. Silius, though executed swiftly, did not vanish from memory either. His name was spoken with both scorn and envy, for few men could claim to have stood so close to the heart of power, even if only for a fleeting season. He had dared to grasp the crown through marriage, and though he failed, the boldness of the attempt thrilled the city. His fall was less pitted than Messalina's, for men envied him the taste of her embrace even as they condemned his folly. Claudius tried to speak of other matters, to focus on the governance of provinces, the appointments of officials, the steady grind of law and tribute. Yet each decree seemed hollow, every triumph diminished. The image of her haunted him, not in the splendor of her beauty but in the terror of her end. He had not seen it, but his mind conjured visions nonetheless: Messalina weeping in the garden, her silks stained, her eyes wide with betrayal. These phantoms tormented him more than truth. The freedmen debated in private how best to guide their emperor forward. Pallas counseled restraint, urging that Rome must not see him weakened by grief. Callistus reminded him of the necessity of appearing strong before both Senate and people. But Narcissus knew the deepest truth: Claudius could never truly escape her shadow. He would live with the memory always, and their task was not to erase it but to ensure it did not consume his ability to rule. Messalina's friends and allies scattered like leaves in the wind. Those who had once feasted in her gardens now avoided even the mention of her name, erasing her from memory to save themselves. A few dared to mourn her in secret, leaving offerings at shrines or whispering prayers in her honor, but such acts were dangerous. Rome had condemned her, and to remember her fondly was to invite suspicion. Forgetting became a survival, even as memory clung stubbornly to the soul. The senators who had witnessed the garden wedding trembled most. They had stood, complicit in silence, and now feared discovery. Some rushed to declare their loyalty to Claudius, others bribed their way into obscurity, hoping their names would not resurface. Rome thrived on scapegoats, and each man feared the finger might turn toward him next. Messalina's fall had left ripples of terror, for betrayal, once uncovered, cast suspicion on all who had stood too near. In the markets, rumors sprouted anew. Some claimed Messalina had tried to flee, others that she had cursed Claudius with her last breath. A few insisted she had been spared in secret, living hidden beyond Rome's walls, waiting to return. The truth mattered less than the thrill of speculation. For the people, the story was not a lesson but a spectacle, a fire to warm themselves by in the cold uncertainty of imperial life. Claudius found solace only in his children, yet even their presence wounded him. Britannicus bore his mother's features, and each glance reminded the emperor of what had been lost. He held his son close, whispering promises of safety and love, though his heart broke at the innocence he could no longer protect. The boy's questions cut deeper than any senator's accusations, for from the mouth of a child, grief is sharper than judgment. Messalina's downfall also emboldened those who hated the idea of women wielding influence. They pointed to her as proof that female ambition brought ruin, that beauty was a weapon too dangerous to trust. The whispers hardened into warnings, shaping the way women of the court were regarded for years to come. Her story became not only a tragedy but a weapon itself, wielded against others who dared to rise. Even in death, she was not free of being used. The gardens where she had once triumphed lay silent, the roses blooming as though mocking the memory of her laughter. Guests no longer gathered there, and the fountains gurgled to no audience. Yet in the stillness, the memory of her feasts lingered. Servants swore they could still hear echoes of music, the clink of cups, the murmur of forbidden vows. Whether imagination or haunting, the gardens bore her ghost more faithfully than any stone inscription ever would. The empire continued, as empires must, but beneath its steady march lay a fracture. Messalina's fall had revealed how fragile power could be, how swiftly loyalty turned to silence, how quickly beauty decayed into ashes. The people watched more closely now, waiting for the next spectacle, for the next figure to rise and fall. Rome was eternal, but its players were fleeting, each condemned to be remembered less for their virtues than for their failures. Claudius spoke less in public, his words measured, his expressions subdued. Some mistook this for strength, others for weakness. But those closest knew the truth. He bore the weight of grief silently, unable to share it lest it tarnish his authority. He became more cautious, more easily swayed by his advisers, seeking in their certainty the stability he lacked within himself. The emperor survived, but not without cost. The aftershocks of Messalina's fall reached even into distant provinces. Governors wrote carefully worded letters of loyalty, fearing suspicion if they appeared too slow in condemnation. In Gaul, in Egypt, in Asia, her name was spoken in whispers, her tale retold with exotic flourishes. Her story traveled faster than armies, a warning etched into the memory of every ambitious soul. For if an empress could fall, who could claim safety beneath Rome's sky? The poets who dared cloak her story in allegory painted her as a rose, brilliant in bloom, swift in decay. Some likened her to Phaeton, grasping for the chariot of the sun only to be struck down by its fire. Others compared her to Medea, a woman consumed by passion and betrayal. Yet even as they condemned, they could not resist the allure of her image. In condemning her, they ensured her immortality in verse. Claudius, in his loneliest hours, wondered if Rome itself had demanded her death, if he had merely been a vessel of its will. He questioned whether love and loyalty could ever survive in the shadow of power, whether any marriage within these marble walls could be anything but doomed. These thoughts he kept locked within himself, for an emperor cannot confess doubt without unraveling the fabric of his reign. Yet in the silence of the night, the questions gnawed without mercy. The freedmen, for all their strength, watched him with unease. They had saved his throne, but in doing so, they had carved away part of his soul. Narcissus alone bore the certainty of necessity, yet even he knew the wound would never fully heal. He had wielded the knife for Rome. But Rome itself cared little for the heart it had severed. The empire endured, indifferent to the pain of those who preserved it. In the years that followed, Messalina's memory did not vanish. It lingered as warning, as scandal, as shadow. Her name became shorthand for betrayal, her tale a reminder of the dangers of desire unrestrained. Yet for those who had known her, whether in love or fear, she remained more than a symbol. She remained a woman, flawed, ambitious, radiant, and doomed. The aftershocks of her fall trembled long after her body lay silent, echoing through Rome like the murmur of distant thunder. And so, Rome moved forward, its stones unshaken, its people restless for the next story. But beneath the eternal grandeur, those who had lived through the night of Messalina's fall carried the memory with them. For in Rome, no fall was ever truly finished. The city thrived on remembrance, and the echoes of her laughter, her betrayal, and her end would murmur through its streets for generations, reminding all who dared to rise that the higher the ascent, the more shattering the fall. The story of Messalina did not end with her final breath, for in Rome, the dead were seldom permitted silence. In the days and months after her execution, her memory was polished and reshaped, like a mirror held to the city's own fears and fascinations. Every retelling of her downfall distorted her further, until the woman herself seemed lost within the layers of myth. Rome did not allow her to rest as flesh and blood, she became an image, a lesson, a caution whispered in both marketplaces and marble halls. Claudius sat in his chambers, staring at polished bronze that reflected a face he scarcely recognized. The emperor who gazed back at him was older, wearier, hollowed by loss. Behind his eyes lingered the shadow of his empress, a presence that no decree could erase. He wondered how Rome would remember him not as the man who ruled but as the man who had loved and killed Messalina. His reflection seemed to mock him, for it was both his own and, somehow, hers. The poets began their work almost immediately. In their verses, Messalina became both villain and siren, her beauty likened to goddesses, her appetite to demons. They described her as a creature who had devoured men, as though her downfall were proof of divine justice. Yet some could not resist softening her image, painting her instead as a tragic heroine undone by passion. Rome required stories to sustain itself. And she was too vivid a figure to be forgotten in silence. In the Senate, her name was invoked as a warning, a means of pressing restraint upon the ambitions of others. Senators spoke of her betrayal when condemning rivals, her folly when debating matters of marriage and loyalty. She had become a weapon in debate, a phantom wielded to score points in the endless games of politics. Few remembered her voice or her laughter, they remembered instead the tale that had been written over her, a tale more powerful than truth. Among the people, the myth grew stranger with every telling. Some said she had not died at all, that she lived in exile under another name, waiting for the chance to return. Others swore her ghost lingered in the palace gardens, walking among roses that bloomed too brightly, listening to the fountains that seemed to echo with muffled laughter. Mothers frightened children with her story, warning them of the dangers of disobedience, while lovers whispered her name in secret, enthralled by her defiance. Claudius himself tried to bury her memory beneath work, signing decrees with trembling hands, attending ceremonies with a blank stare. But the city was relentless in its reminders. A garment once worn by her appeared at a feast, and he turned pale. A senator accidentally let slip her name in a speech, and the emperor's lips quivered. The mirror of Rome reflected her at every turn, reminding him that though she was gone, she was not gone from him. Narcissus, ever practical, urged him to let the past remain buried. He spoke of the empire's needs, of the dangers of sentiment. Yet even Narcissus knew that memory cannot be banished by decree. Rome itself had claimed her now, reshaping her into something larger than life. The freedman had orchestrated her fall, yet even he felt the unease of her lingering presence. It was as though he had slain her body but could not silence her story. In private, Claudius sometimes returned to her chambers, though they had long since been stripped of her belongings. He would sit upon the edge of her bed, staring at the empty space where she once lay, and feel the weight of absence press against him. He did not speak her name aloud, for fear of being overheard, but he whispered it in silence to himself, as though confessing a forbidden prayer. In those moments, he was not emperor but widower, lost in a shadow he could not escape. Rome's satirists found new life in her tale, their jokes sharp as blades. They painted her as insatiable, as ridiculous, as monstrous, exaggerating her actions until they became grotesque caricatures. Crowds laughed at plays that mocked her, delighting in the spectacle of her downfall replayed upon wooden stages. Yet beneath the laughter lay fascination, for the audience could not look away. They laughed to protect themselves from the truth that power and desire were mirrors of their own lives. Messalina's myth also reached beyond Rome. In distant provinces, her story traveled with merchants and soldiers, growing more elaborate with each retelling. In Gaul, they said she had sought to crown herself Queen of Rome. In Egypt, they whispered she had invoked forbidden gods to secure her power. In Greece, her tale was woven into tragedies, her name placed beside those of Medea and Helen. She was no longer a woman, she was legend, her image refracted into countless forms. Claudius's daughter Octavia grew under this shadow, her mother's name whispered but never spoken openly. She learned from tutors to be cautious, to be obedient, to avoid the fate that had devoured Messalina. Yet in her heart, the girl wondered who her mother had truly been. Was she monster, was she victim, or was she something neither tale could capture? For Octavia, the mirror reflected not myth but a question without answer, one that would shape her own destiny. Britannicus bore the legacy more heavily. Too young to understand, he nonetheless carried his mother's blood and features, reminders that unsettled even Claudius. Some looked upon him with suspicion, as though he were destined to inherit her flaws. The myth of Messalina was not confined to her, it stretched forward into her children, branding them with a shadow they had not chosen. Her story was a chain that bound even the innocent. The courtiers of Rome watched with sharpened eyes, measuring how the emperor would recover. Some saw weakness in his grief, an opportunity to press their own ambitions. Others feared the instability her absence created, wondering if the emperor could rule without her influence. Yet all knew that the myth of Messalina would shape the court for years to come. She had become a mirror in which others saw their own risks reflected, a myth that dictated their behavior long after her death. In the temples, priests spoke cautiously of her, weaving her into sermons as an example of divine justice. They warned that lust and ambition brought ruin, that even the empress herself had not escaped the gods' judgment. Yet beneath their piety lay unease, for they too had once accepted her offerings, blessed her rituals, praised her beauty. The mirror of religion reshaped her into a cautionary tale, but the memory of her devotion remained, troubling their certainty. Claudius's nights were haunted by dreams. He saw her face in the darkness, sometimes smiling, sometimes accusing, sometimes weeping. In his dreams, she was not myth but woman, and her humanity pierced him with unbearable clarity. He awoke trembling, his sheets damp, his chest aching as though grief itself had taken physical form. The emperor who had ordered her death could not free himself from the intimacy of memory. Rome's myth was cold, but his private mirror was burning. The people of Rome, fickle in their loves, moved on to other scandals. Yet Messalina's story lingered beneath the surface, ready to be revived whenever new tales of excess emerged. Her name became shorthand for betrayal, invoked with a sneer, wielded as insult. The myth had devoured the woman, and now it belonged to the city. She had become a ghost not of memory but of language itself, condemned to live forever in Rome's speech. Her gardens, once alive with music and feasts, grew over with silence. Yet even in neglect, they seemed to breathe her presence. Servants swore that roses bloomed brighter there than anywhere else, their fragrance almost too heavy to bear. The fountains gurgled with restless water, as though whispering secrets. Nature itself seemed unwilling to forget her, holding her memory in the shimmer of petals and the murmur of flowing streams. Claudius aged swiftly in the years after her death. His shoulders bent beneath the invisible weight, his voice softened into weariness. He still ruled, but the spark of vitality was gone. When he looked into mirrors, he no longer saw himself as emperor but as survivor, a man marked by tragedy. The myth that had consumed Messalina had consumed him too, though in silence rather than spectacle. He lived, but always as reflection of what had been lost. Messalina's enemies, those who had rejoiced in her fall, found themselves uneasy with time. For though they had destroyed her, her myth grew stronger than their triumph. She was remembered, whispered, debated. They were forgotten. The mirror of history reflected her, not them, and this irony gnawed at their pride. To kill a person is simple, to kill their memory is impossible. Rome itself had chosen to remember her, and memory is stronger than any sword. The myth spread into art, her likeness carved upon cheap amphorae and painted in shadowed corners of villas. These images were never faithful, they showed her as temptress, as queen, as witch, as goddess. Each artist used her as mirror for their own fears and desires, creating 100 Messalinas, none of them true. Yet in this distortion lay her immortality. No single face could capture her, and so she lived on in fragments, each one preserving a piece of her essence. Claudius, in his final years, rarely spoke of her. Yet those who attended him swore that at times he seemed to whisper her name under his breath, as though invoking a ghost. His eyes grew distant, fixed upon a memory only he could see. Rome had claimed her as myth, but in his heart, she remained a wound unhealed, a reflection that never faded. In the mirror of his soul, she was neither villain nor victim, but the woman he had once loved and lost. The myth of Messalina became both curse and fascination for generations. She was cited in histories as warning, dramatized in plays as spectacle, whispered in bedrooms as fantasy. She was held up as proof of female treachery and as symbol of feminine power. The truth was long buried, but the myth thrived. Rome had no need for truth, it needed mirrors to reflect itself, and in Messalina, it found one more perfect than she could ever have imagined. Even as emperors rose and fell after Claudius, her name endured. She was not remembered for her kindnesses, her laughter, her fleeting moments of tenderness. She was remembered as Rome required her to be an empress of lust, a queen of betrayal, a mirror for the empire's anxieties about love, power, and desire. The woman had died, but the myth was immortal. And as Rome thrived upon myth more than memory, she became eternal. The gardens where she had once crowned herself in roses grew into legend, their silence mistaken for sacredness. Lovers dared not linger there, fearing the whisper of her ghost. Children were told to avoid them, lest the empress claim their souls. Superstition entwined with memory until even empty spaces bore her presence. The city had no grave to honor her, but it did not need one. Her resting place was the myth itself, woven into every street and story. Thus the mirror of Messalina reflected endlessly, multiplying her image across Rome and beyond. She was not who she had been in life, but what the empire required her to be: a parable, a warning, a fascination. In death, she had achieved what she could never grasp in life: immortality, though twisted, though cruel. Her name remained alive on every tongue, her story etched into every heart. And in the mirror of Rome, she would always stand, radiant and damned.